So good afternoon, everyone, and you're very welcome to our second Fields of Knowledge session for the 2025-2026 season. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, the premise, or just the backdrop to Fields of Knowledge, is we hope to bring together researchers, we hope to bring together service providers, people who work in the wider field of agriculture or rural development, together with community members and farmers, to try and have discuss some of the more pressing challenges that rural or farming communities face. As I said, this is the second session of the 2025-2026 season. Last week's one, we had a very interesting conversation, or last month's session, we had a very interesting conversation about rural communities and the rising rates of drug overdoses and suicides and alcoholism and measures to help support community members within that context. Today, we alter a bit, we pivot to a very different type of topic that could be somewhat related, where we look at dairy food system centralization and farm consolidation across New York State. And we hope to have a very nuanced conversation in relation to that and how that's been experienced at a community and a farm level. We've a very interesting panel here, as you can see in front of you. I'll briefly introduce everyone in a few moments, but just first, a couple of housekeeping rules in relation to today's session. So the chat function is opened, as you can see at the top banner of your desktop or phone. And we encourage attendees to share whatever reflections, comments, or queries that you have as the session is underway. But just be mindful of when you are sharing comments, to be conscious of everyone within the chat and our panelists today. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce our panelists. So first, we have Bret Bossard, who is a dairy farmer based in central New York State. He's the co-owner of Barbland and White Eagle Dairy, milking 4,000 cows daily, managing 10,000 acres across central New York, with more than 80 employees as part of the enterprise. Then we have Dr. Jim MacDonald, who is a professor of agricultural economics at the University of Maryland, and whose research focuses on the industrial organization of food and agriculture, and much of his work has specifically focused on trends within the dairy sector. Then we have our own Duane Martin, who's a former dairy farmer from a fifth-generation farm in Delaware County in New York State. Duane now works as a ROPS Hotline coordinator here at the New York Center for Agricultural Medicine and Health. And last but not least, then we have David Fisher from the New York Farm, who's the New York Farm Bureau president. He's a Cornell graduate and a dairy farmer in St. Lawrence County, and brings a multitude of perspectives to the topic at hand today. So you're all very welcome. Thanks a million for joining us. Jim, I might come to you first. If you want to kind of maybe set the scene for us in terms of some of the data and numbers and trends that you've seen in recent years or recent decades, and how you think that has evolved.
Yeah, sure. Before coming to Maryland about 5 years ago, I spent most of my career at the Economic Research Service of U.S. Department of Agriculture, where I ran a lot of farm surveys, including several focused dairy surveys that we do every 5 years or so. And I had a major research focus on structural transformation of U.S. agriculture. And I can tell you, across agriculture and across commodities, you see steady shifts to larger farms. But you see a much bigger, much faster, much more dramatic shift in dairy, much more so than in any other commodity. I can also say I spent 20 years between going to college and teaching in upstate New York. And the changes in New York mirror what goes on nationally, except all those changes, decline of smaller operations, shifts to bigger operations, are going on within the state. And just to touch a few numbers. We pull things out of the Census of Agriculture, which happens every 5 years. So conveniently, I can compare 2002 to the most recent, 2022. Back in 2002, 60% of the cows in the state were on farms with herds of 10 to 200 cows, what I would call a small commercial farm. The dominant type of farm back in the 80s, it had been shrinking in importance through 2002, but it was still 60% of all cows. In the 20 years after that, going to 2022, fraction of cows in those types of farms fell from 60% of the state's milk cows to 15%. And the number of those dairy farms fell by 75%. They'd been declining before. I would say it's accelerated in recent years. Now, total number of cows in the state fell modestly. Milk production actually has grown quite a bit in the last 20 years. The big shift is towards much larger farms. The census for New York, the largest category we track is 1,000 head and above. 2002, that was 10% of all cows. 2022, it was 50% of all cows, and I can tell you it's certainly more today. So in New York and across the United States, what we see is a major dramatic shift towards much larger but fewer dairy farms. And in my view, the driving force is cost differences, important economies of scale. I'll be happy to talk about that later, but I'll just leave the basic shift for now and we can go on from there.
Right, that's really compelling, Jim. And it, I think it's fair to say it's quite acute in that in a 20-year period, given the wider context of the importance of dairy to New York State in over a multitude of decades. Brad, I might come to you next because I was reading, Morrisville had a lovely bio about you that I was reading before today's session, and I think your story and history within dairy farming might help encapsulate that. I noticed that you started your internship in the early noughties in Barbland, and Barbland started off as a potato farm in the 1950s, if I'm right in saying, and where it's came to today. I don't know if you just want to touch on that, Bret, in the context of your own experience.
Sure. Yeah, our dairy, that I'm on today as a partner of is, like you mentioned, about 4,000 cows. I came here in 2003 as an intern, and at that time had about 900 cows. But previous to that, I grew up on a 50 cow dairy, actually out in the corner of Steuben in Allegheny County. So grew up on a small farm out there. Came to Morrisville, like you mentioned, for a couple of years, and then did a couple of years at Cornell, and then started here on the farm I'm part owner of as an intern, actually. So have seen a wide array of things, and this was not by any means my plan coming out of college. I'd still plan on going back to my parents' farm back in the early 2000s when I graduated. But this is where things have led me, and glad to be here.
Great. David, I might come to you next, if that works. As being, farmer yourself and being the New York Farm Bureau president, you have your own experience within farming. You represent a lot of farmers with the bureau. Can you just speak to me about maybe how those trends you think have been experienced over the years among dairy farmers that you speak to, and then maybe from your own experience as well?
Sure. It's changed. My ancestors 200 years ago came to Northern New York and had a little bit more of a diversified operation, did a few things, put turkeys and cream on trains and sent it to New York City, and everything changes. It's been changing. Things have been evolving, but the world has changed, right? So,
right.
The country wants cheap food, and we've had a great land grant at Cornell that's provided a lot of technical support and new research ideas, and that's allowed us to produce more at a lower cost. The American consumers have one of the cheapest food supplies in the world as a percent of capita income. And that seems to be a driving factor. And some of the regulations that have come upon us as far as labor and food safety and all those other things have driven a lot of people to choose not to do it or not compete. And
right.
I think there's a lot of positives in some of the other things. If you look back in 50 years, our per cow production is double. So we're making almost twice as much milk on half as many cows. And when you look at things like our carbon footprint, it's a 60% reduction in emissions per unit output from some recent Cornell data. So I think from an environmental standpoint, we're doing the best we can do. We always try to do better and improve, and that's what farmers have done for the last basically 150 years. Since the 1850s and 60s, there's been consolidation. And where it lands, I don't really know. But those of us that continue to be dedicated and involved are trying to find ways to do it, enjoy the rural lifestyle, and support rural economies and provide food for the country.
Right. I think with all this, it's like weighing up the cost benefit analysis of that and what feeds into that kind of that equation. And Duane, I might come to you next, because you've had your own interesting experience and with dairy farming too as well, in recent years. And I don't know, would you mind just like introducing, I suppose, your own kind of briefly your own context of dairy farm, coming from a fifth generation farm, and yeah, and how that has led to maybe where you are today.
I'm going to piggyback on what Dave said. Just in my lifetime, I've seen changes compared to like my grandfather went from farming from horses to tractors. And like Dave says, the world changes and technology keeps changing and evolving. And you have to either be willing to change like Bret did, or you're going to fall behind. And I know in our case, there was no way we could really expand. We had our school on one side, and there were some other dynamics too. And I think for me was, I just felt that, I mean, either we're going to have to really bite the bullet and really expand and gamble, or I would have to go do something else. And for me, I felt, best way to describe it, I felt like I was in an arms race trying to catch up. And my opinion was it was better for me financially. It made more sense to leave. Now, it was probably the hardest decision I ever made. And Dave knows that personally because we chatted about it a couple times. But I think probably as far as what I've seen in our community is we've seen such a dramatic shift in terms of understanding, even on the local level, about agriculture, and I've seen conflicts kind of start to arise.
Right.
For instance, like Dave is well aware of, last year in our county, we had an issue with a farmer over there was a zoning issue because he was putting up greenhouses to diversify his farm, and there was an issue over zoning and an effort not to allow him to do that. Where before, if there was more people that understood agriculture, I don't think it would have been a problem. I'll give you another quick example. Our director of planning, who comes from an ag background, said she had gotten a complaint from a person saying there was this big beautiful lawn and was only mowed 3 times a year. She could understand why the guy didn't mow it. Well, it turns out when she visited it was a hay field. It's just that lack of understanding which has kind of changed our community. But what I do think though is like what Dave was saying, and also Bret. I mean, I like Bret. I wasn't. I've returned. I'm like Bret. I returned home to the farm. If I had to do it over again, I would end up like Bret, going to a larger operation. It's just the cost of production. You just cannot compete against it. If you're small, you have to expand for your economics of scale.
That makes sense. I'm just thinking there as you're talking, Duane, and it kind of feeds into maybe some of the other points that have been brought up. So like the economics of it have changed a lot in terms of viability, but also in parallel to that, the culture of farming has changed. In that, in previous generations, like being good farmer in the sense of hands-on land, herd management, grassland management, all those things. I'm not saying that those aren't important, but there's a whole other dimension that has had to come into it too as well in terms of business management around farm operations now and the viability of it and weighing up economies of scale, as Jim briefly mentioned. And I'm wondering, how has that lended to some people exiting the market, staying in the market, and evolving maybe to a place that makes the farm viable. I don't know, Bret, if you want to kind of jump in on that, because your experience coming from, you said you know Morrisville, you're at Cornell and stuff. You now work not on your home farm, you work on a farm that you did your internship on or co-run that farm. How has that shifted, I suppose, and in skill sets that you've had to evolve to manage the operation that you're managing now?
Certainly has changed, and my roles over the last 18 years here have certainly changed as well. More than that, since I've 18 years of ownership has changed as the business has evolved and grown, and most of that's been dictated by what others have previously mentioned, just the economies of scale. Every farm kind of has their niche. Your niche might be organic, or your niche might be non-GMO, or our niche is just is volume and quality. So every farm kind of has to fall into their own little bucket and where they can fit in. And right here in our area of New York, actually, we still have a lot of smaller dairies as well that neighbor right around us. So I would say in Madison County probably bucks that trend of for the average herd size, because we still have several herds under 100 cows that are farming around us, and neighbors and friends of ours. Some maybe have diversified into on-farm processing, direct to consumer, some of that stuff. So there's niches for everybody. Ours is just kind of head us the direction that we're in. But yeah, certainly as it's evolved, that's kind of what drew me to this. Growing up, I was a cow person. I enjoyed the animals, the hands-on with the animals. I'm not one that deals well with with an engine. If I got my hand in a tight spot working on something, trying to loosen a bolt that I can't see, and it just isn't how I work. I work with an animal that has a brain, and dealing with that type of thing, it's just how I click. And so that kind of led me to this avenue, rather than like you mentioned, Connor, going home and maybe having to be more of a jack of all trades. Right. That's one of the nice things on a larger operation. You can be more specialized if you just like animals, or if you just like equipment, things like that. You can be a little bit more specialized in your fields, and then obviously give some flexibility, right? As we all have goals in life, and if you've got 80 or 100 people on your team, it's a little easier to achieve those goals sometimes, than if there's one or two of you. So that's kind of the way that we've evolved our business. Right.
And then there's obviously the whole managerial side of it that you have. I mentioned you have 80 employees on the farm and stuff like that, which would have been a consideration, I suppose, well, to a lesser degree when you were growing up, or for your parents' generation, and that. So there's that whole side of it that I just find fascinating about how the culture has shifted from a real hands-on to much more business operated type of farmer. Jim, I'm wondering from your data, and you may or may not be able to speak to this, but in terms of, we talked about earlier, about, and it kind of comes back to David's point about being conditioned to cheaper food and this, and this kind of scale model lends to that type of efficiency. And that, I'm wondering, what is the other argument for that in terms of dairy centralization or food system centralization across local businesses, schools, and stuff like that? I know there's something we would have talked about, Duane, before. I don't know if you want to jump in on that, Jim, in widening the argument or widening the discussion on food system centralization.
Generally speaking, broadly in agriculture, we've had high productivity growth compared to other industries since the mid-1930s. And that does, most innovation and productivity growth in agriculture winds up translating into lower prices, and therefore benefits to people buying agricultural commodities. within, and some of that is just innovation that affects all farms. Some of it is structural change towards larger farms realizing scale economies. Within dairy, we've had a much lower rise in retail prices for fluid milk and for cheese over the last 20 to 25 years, much lower than overall inflation.
Right.
I think that's in part, in significant part, because of those structural changes in scale economies. And one thing we should try to keep in mind is that is to think about who those buyers are, and that comes back to lower income households spend a much higher share of their income on food and on dairy products, and in particular on fluid milk. As a result, changes in prices have a disproportionate impact on the spending power of lower income households. And that becomes, that's part of what makes this stuff a complex issue, right? Big dramatic changes towards bigger farms, complex, important impacts on, people who are buying that stuff. So.
Right. Right. I think that, good, because really it's existing, that change is existing at that level. And so many of us, not unless you have a degree in economics, these things are very hard to understand, and I think breaking that down and for people to understand that is very important.
I repeat that a lot.
Yeah. I know, Duane, we talked about that, about the change you've experienced in South Courtright, and farms being pushed out of the market.
Well, I'll give you, if I can, Connor, I'll give you some examples to everybody. 1947, there was 52 feed mills in Delaware County. Today, there's only one. And it's a combination of the farms going out and also the economic scales they have to face in order to compete. You take the one existing feed mill had actually moved its location. We share it with Otsego County. Their reason for moving was to get the economics of scale of the interstate system, because they travel from all the way from the Maryland state border with Pennsylvania all the way up to the Canadian border, now to New England, and all the way out to Western New York now.
Right.
And it's because they had to capture the economics of scale of moving that much grain, dairy concentrate, to farmers, and they decided to also specialize in providing dairy rations versus, let's say, fertilizer or other services. Now we have one old Agway store. They have diversified into providing crop production services, but I don't see how they're eventually going to hold on because of rising cost of labor and energy cost, and they just don't do the volume.
Mm-hmm.
And it's really provided quite a challenge for the existing farms too in our region, that we no longer have the farm service support. That has been on the negative side, I think, of consolidation, is stuff like breeders, veterinarians.
Right.
You look at what happened in the equipment industry. We've had some major even local mergers on the dealership level. They just they just don't have the customers, so they have to consolidate as well. And we're even seeing it now within the insurance agencies as well. My insurance company has just been, my insurance broker, I should say, has been consolidated with another insurance broker just to gain the advantage of economics of scale and doing more with less. And I think that's just the way it is with all economies, but especially agriculture. We have to do more with less. And I think you would probably agree with that too, Bret and Dave. That's one of the things how farmers have survived, is they've done more. They've done more with less resources. And if you want me to, I can even go into some of the other things which we have seen in Delaware County.
Yeah, we might come back. We might come back to that. I was just wondering, from a Farm Bureau perspective, David, in like the representative body for farmers, how do you see Farm Bureau's role in this? You know, and dependent on where farmers are at. You know, if they're dealing with the viability of their model, they're dealing with whether they should take on more debt. They're dealing with, where should they expand? You know, they have these real queries and not knowing where the future kind of lands for them. I'm wondering about, Farm Bureau's role within that.
Well, I think it's all over the board, and Brent said it well. There's a lot of people have decided to diversify, and
Right.
a lot of rural economies, instead of depending on a lot of small farms, that there's been some consolidation, but there's also been a lot of that land bought up by people that maybe have a few beef or a few horses or sheep or goats, which all those things are part of the rural economy. So it's just different. But specific to dairy, there's quite a few smaller producers that have decided to do on-farm processing and
Right.
go that way and still have the lifestyle they want, if it's their choice, that they don't want to deal with the labor that Brent or I deal with. They can do some of those things in a small family operation, and by diversifying and being direct to market, they're getting vertically integrated, and they're surviving and doing well. So it's all how people want to prioritize their goals in life, of what they want to deal with, and the risks that they want to take. And none of it is for the faint of heart. It's
Right.
hard work. It's challenging. It's rewarding in a lot of ways.
Right.
And it's a great way to raise a family. So I think it all comes down to people's personal choice.
Yeah. And when you talk about diversifying, you mean like a niche market, like farmers markets, selling direct to customers, that kind of stuff, or diversifying into another sector and using maybe your land for whatever it might be. See people like are in agritourism, that kind of stuff.
All of the above.
All of the above. Yeah.
Yeah, because jump in, because Delaware County is a prime example where we underwent a renaissance of what Dave was talking about, where we've seen a lot of dairy operations transitioning into beef, for instance, or because they already have the equipment and the facilities, it was much easier for them to transition into beef.
Mm-hmm.
And we've also seen a vegetable market develop in our region too, and even some community supported organizations, community agriculture CSAs, take root. We have a couple of very successful ones.
Right. And like just playing devil's advocate to that then, and right, that might sound like plausible for us here to diversify in that, but if you have built and you come from a generation of dairy farmers who have farmed in a particular way, to have to reshape your model of what you go about, it can be a tricky message to just take on board and to adapt to, I suppose. And I could understand why there would be like resistance to that. There would be frustration with the model that they're faced with. They could feel that they're being pushed out of something that their family have kind of identified themselves through, and their communities they identify themselves through for a very long time.
Change is hard, but it's all how you deal with the cards you're dealt. So, a lot of places where there's poor land, small fields, different things like that, that's not conducive to newer, bigger equipment, then, beef, horses, small ruminants is probably a better thing. And that's part of figuring out where you can fit.
Right.
And even as dairy, Bret and I don't do all the same things the same way. Everybody has a niche and a different methods, and if you're successful, it's in many different ways.
I'm just wondering, Jim, then from your data and that, like, where do you see this going? Like, where do you see the long-term trajectory of this?
I'll just start by saying that Dave and Bret represent the nightmare for a statistician, because we pretend that we have averages and things are alike. But we know whenever we talk to them or ever we visit a farm, they're all different.
Right.
They're all doing somewhat different things. Yeah, I'm going to come in to your question. I'm going to come in and be a little bit negative, I guess, because whenever we've done these studies of farm consolidation, now going back 20 years, there's always some relatively small farms that are doing relatively well and hanging on, and often just in the ways that we've heard described so far, adding on a little bit of value add, a little bit of agritourism, something like that. But I have to say, year after year, that those counts of small farms decline. There's no year in which it increases. State of Wisconsin, for example, publishes every month the number of licensed dairy herds. For 20 years, there's been no month in which it's increased. It keeps going down, and that decline has actually, I think, accelerated both in Wisconsin and in northeastern states in the last censuses. So, I mean, I see on the ground everything you guys have described, in the sense of looking for different things to do, finding different things to do that adjust to the environment you're in, and finding a number of small farms that, are actually pretty successful. On the other hand, the big numbers are pretty powerful. And I expect to see a continued shift of milk production to bigger farms and away from smaller farms. And I expect to see more and more smaller operations transitioning completely out of dairy. That's where the pressures have been going. I wish it wasn't, but I think that the data we have are just overwhelming in that direction.
Well, I think dairy's tough because it's 24/7, 365. You can't walk away. You can't take a vacation. And lifestyle has driven some of this. And I think we need to recognize it. People don't want to work as much. It's challenging, but yet people don't want to be tied to it as much to have a family lifestyle.
Yeah.
And some of the things that we've done let us do that. And we've got several members of our team at home that used to have a dairy and have decided that it's, they can get some of the same challenges and rewards, but they aren't tied to it, 24/7 like we used to be. As when I grew up, you did chores in the morning, you went to school, came home, did chores, and if you had any family time, it might have been Sunday afternoon for a few hours. And it's by expanding and specializing and having enough people to trade off and have time off has been a big plus. And so I think that's part of why some of us have done what we've done.
Let me come back and ask you guys this question. A few years ago, I visited a Minnesota farm that had just adopted robotic milkers. And when I asked them, why, what they said was, because I still want to be walking when I'm 70, and we want to take vacations, and we don't want to be milking 7 hours a day anymore. And we want to convince our daughter, who's in vet school, to be at the farm without milking. Have you guys been looking at robotic milkers, and what does that look like to you? And does that explanation for the Minnesota farm make any sense to you?
Yeah, sure. It's robotics have added another choice. It's another venue to diversify, I guess, almost in your labor pool, certainly. For us, we've already kind of outgrown probably that size for robotics. That makes sense just because of the cost to implement robotics at this point. Labor might be chasing the costs of implement robotics quite quickly, but for us, it doesn't quite fit our model, but it is an avenue, and probably more so for some of those smaller to medium-sized farms that might be under 500 cows. The way the technology is today, the technology will evolve. I mean, Connor's question earlier, what it's going to look like in the future, the only thing we can all guarantee it's going to be different, right? Doesn't matter what is going today, whether you like it or not, it's going to be different in 5 years, 10 years, 20 years. So it's figuring out where you fit in the grand scheme of things, and how, things like robotics, we adopt things at different times and make sense for our business. But the robotics are certainly something that I think probably have been a great thing for some of those smaller mid-sized farms to be able to like Dave was mentioning, some of the lifestyle things and being able to free up some stuff. But for us at our scale right now, we're not really looking necessarily at the dynamics. And I guess just something quick that I'd like to touch on is, we do a lot of tours, bring in a lot of people just for those reasons that Connor mentioned earlier of, rural economy is generations removed now from agriculture, and they don't have a grandfather or an uncle that had a farm. So it, being more transparent with the public. And the biggest thing that we like to really address in this front when we have people out to the farm is, bigger isn't bad, right? So we hear bigger farms, but I would stick my neck out and say that it doesn't matter if you're 40 cows today or 4,000 cows today, you're doing a better job farming than you did 40 years ago, just because we have to, right? Farmers are, we didn't have the word sustainability when I was in college, but farmers are the ultimate definition of sustainability. We've been farming for hundreds and thousands of years, and we adapted, we changed. Science, technology, evolution allows us to do things differently. And for me, I think it, that kind of hits that home is even us being a larger farm, 4,000 cows. We've got with our part-time employees, we're around 100 employees. So you do that math, that's 40 cows per worker. Mm-hmm. So whether you're one person milking 40 cows, or we are 100 people milking 4,000 cows in the Northeast, because of a little thing called winter, we need barns, and we can't quite get away from some of these economies of scales that the South and West can. But so it's just that struggle. And like Dave mentioned earlier, of those employees that we have, probably 10% of those are also people that maybe, I guess they didn't retire from farming, but have transitioned away from owning their farm, or are, children of farmers. Some of those things too that, change. It was mentioned earlier, change is the only constant. So.
Super interesting. I think I'm just wondering at this point if any of the attendees had any questions. I see Destiny put into the chat. We've kind of covered a lot of ground so far. We have roughly about somewhere between 5 and 10 minutes left. If anyone would like to share any comments, queries, or reflections on what's been addressed so far, please feel free to do so. Bret, sorry, I was just wondering again, back to David's point about the kind of like lifestyle farming too as well that you hit on. And it's interesting when you look at some of the census of the sense of agriculture and the types of farms that are there now, and they call it this kind of barbell curve, where you have a lot of farms, a lot of very small farms. Actually, very small farms have actually grown at a greater frequency than very large farms. Very small farms, I mean, like under about 10 acres. So you have a lot of like hobby farming now and stuff like that. And equally, the not to the same degree, but very large farms have grown too as well. And both, I think, are plausibly the more conducive to lifestyle type of farming, because you would have more employees. You're able to take more time off. People have working hours and days, where perhaps the mid-scale farm and the family-based farm, it would have been very identity orientated, would have been very full on, very labor heavy on family members. So I don't know if anyone wants to jump in on that type of advancement or change that you've seen. Maybe Duane, you have perspectives on it, and maybe the other way was better. And this is, I suppose, the whole argument is trying to have a reflective conversation on the pros and cons of this shift.
Well, it took me a long time to feel comfortable selling the cows and doing something different. It was a very hard learning curve, but I'm glad I did it. I just think, myself having that change in lifestyle allowed me to do things I never probably would have ever done. For instance, I've been to 2 American Farm Bureau conventions. I never would have done that, for instance, if we still were milking cows, like what Dave said there. You were tied 24/7 to your farm, and there's no way I could have ever done that. For myself, my identity was my cows. And yes, it was very hard watching them go. And I remember one cow particularly had this look, why did you do this to me? What did I do? Um, but looking back, um, it was the best thing I know for me to do. Um, may not be the best thing for everybody to do, but I know for me personally, it was the best choice. There was other factors too. I was looking at the consolidation, for instance. Our milk plant was purchased, and I did not think we were going to have. It was at a time when milk processors were not taking extra milk on, and I just did not see. I just didn't want to be the last one on the sinking ship, so to speak, either. And I just did, I personally decided it was the best choice for me. Now, there's times, yes, I do feel guilty about not actually being involved in agriculture the way I am, but those days are being outweighed by much better days of realizing here, working at NYCAMH, that I'm still able to contribute to agriculture.
Right.
And I think some of it too is with farmers is because especially smaller farmers, the day to day, you're so wrapped up in your world, you can't see beyond. You think this is the only thing I can do. And most farmers are very, very talented. Both Dave and Bret are very, very talented. And I've seen so many farmers be very, very talented, and they just don't realize that. Now, if you talk to Dave, he will tell you he never thought he would be in such a public role as New York Farm Bureau president. Sorry to pick on you, Dave, but I remember our conversations. You had said that you never thought you would be where you are today, and so I mean, we all evolve and we all change, and I think unfortunately farmers don't realize that because they're so wrapped up in their day-to-day operations that they can't think beyond what the next thing they have to do for their farm.
Right. Right. Because I'm wondering about that, and I'm wondering about the people that are in that space, where the viability might not be there, and supports for them to try and help them make a decision and to see themselves as in the kind of, as you said, Duane, to not narrow them skill set into a particular task and to try and help make the transition to another field or easier or straightforward in that. Obviously you've done that successfully, and you've been very open about your story about how difficult that was at times. I don't know, Dave, do you have any perspectives on that too as well, or Duane, would you like to come back in on I suppose your experience and maybe advice that you'd have for the farming community that are kind of in that position, or that are in between, maybe whether they're going to stay going at it, or as they say in the social science, positively deviate?
Well, I kind of ran my mouth a little too much. I'll defer to Dave, and then you can come back to me.
Well, I think we all realize financial stress is probably the biggest stress there is, and it happens. But there are resources. FarmNet is a great resource. They have good counselors that work with farm families regularly. It's a good program. American Farm Bureau has a mental health awareness hotline. So there is help out there. Hopefully most don't get to that point, but change is hard for everybody, and especially the farmers and the farm community. Change is, I think, harder than most other changes that happen in life, whether it be changing jobs or whatever it is, because like Duane said, it is an identity thing, and there's a lot tied to it, and a lot of times it's multi-generational, so it becomes probably more emotional than it should and needs to be. And we just got to try to be aware of neighbors and support where we can and help where we can and talk to people when we need to.
Right, because I heard somebody describe it before as the culture lags reality, in that the culture, as you mentioned there, for generational families is that you will maintain that generational responsibility of the farm, come hell or high water. but you know, many farmers today are farming in a very different environment than what previous generations were, you know, and that can have a huge weight. And I know that might be easy to stay here, but um, and to, I suppose, help farmers realize that their skill set, as you know, as someone like Duane here has showed, can be adapted in other areas and other contexts too as well. We're on these sessions are, we said, are supposed to be 45 minutes. We're just gone slightly over that time. And I'd encourage any of the attendees, again, before we finish up, if you have any comments, questions, or queries, to please feel free to put them into the chat before we wrap up. I'm just wondering, Jim, if you have any like closing remarks or perhaps even closing questions for our panelists as well also.
The one thing I thought of that I think comes out in the conversation among the three farmers here, that we never pick up in our statistics, is that when we run people on farm tours, and you know, we found it increasingly difficult at USDA to find people that grew up on a farm, so we bring them out on a lot of tours. What was always striking was the family element in continuing a business or growing it. You know, you'd get a story that said, well, my wife died, so I was shrinking the dairy herd. Then my daughter surprised me. She and her husband wanted to come back to the farm, so we had to expand. And I tell you, those stories just come up all the time in those almost chants of what the family wants to do, how they adapt, and what the opportunities are there for them to adapt to. As Duane said, and he didn't really, in his place, have the opportunity to do much expansion. And I think that just comes up whenever I wind up talking to farmers on tours, is almost that random chance of family connections, as well as the particular place they happen to be and whether they can do something with it. So I'm familiar with these types of conversations because they come up all the time.
Interesting. Bret, I don't know, do you have any closing remarks before we finish now?
Yes, certainly. And to Jim's point, I mean, it's, not sure if I mentioned at the beginning, but I'm a fourth generation dairy farmer on both my mom and dad's side of the family. But I'm not on my family's farm, you know. So the farm that I'm on today came here, as I mentioned, through an internship, and myself and Luke Heisman is my other partner that are my generation. The previous generation is two different families. So there's four family owners, but none of us are blood. But we're still a family farm. We still look at it that, and we don't even look at it as the owners. You know, those 100 employees are our family, right? So we're attending birthday parties and graduations and weddings of our employees, and and that's why some of these decisions are so hard, because like you mentioned, agriculture and certainly dairy, it's a livelihood. It's not a career choice for most of us. It's a passion, and it's what we love to do. And I think, we're blessed that we have the opportunity to do it. I think that maybe sometimes it comes down to getting lost in that, is it a right to be a farmer or an opportunity? And you can't take the opportunity for granted. And I think there's many opportunities out there similar to my own that, Dave would know the statistics, but the aging population, there's a lot of farms that are getting to that retirement age that don't have that next generation coming. So, for people that maybe are in an area today that isn't a viable part of the state, or looking to get into, the entry into this business is certainly difficult from a cost standpoint, but there's a lot of opportunity, certainly in the Northeast and New York for, people looking for the next generation to take over their farm, and not getting tied down that it has to be blood.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Pretty good, yeah. Duane or David, would you like to jump in?
Go ahead,
I think
Dave.
Bret said it pretty well. So sorry, go ahead, Duane.
No, go ahead, Dave. I was telling you to go ahead.
I think what Bret said is pretty true. I'm blessed that I have two sons that decided they both wanted to try to farm. And so that allows me to get away and do Farm Bureau stuff. But I had a great career working with my sister and two brother-in-laws, and my uncle and my dad. So it was blood, but I think we all know the reality of that is it's great and family's great until it's not. So sometimes non-family partners, there's not as many emotions tied to it. So sometimes that gets easier probably. But I think there's huge opportunities, and I think we're at a great place in a lot of ways in this state and country because there's a huge focus on the food system. And I see huge interest in FFAs all across New York and the country, 4-H, young people. I don't like what all the influencers say, but there's a lot of influencers out there talking about food. And I think in the long run, it's going to be good for all of us. And whether you're 40 cows or 4,000 or, in the Midwest, 20 or 40,000 is the number. I think there's going to be some challenges, but yeah, a lot of opportunities. So I look forward to seeing what comes.
Very well said, David. Yeah. Duane, would you like to close us out?
Yeah, well, first thing I'd like to say is I think farmers sell themselves a little too short, that they can't do anything else when, if I can make the changes that I did, anybody can, even if it was a school of hard knocks and the change. But I do think, like Dave and Bret said, there is a lot of opportunities out there if people are willing to look beyond the safety of their little world. And the other thing too is one constant change is we're gonna keep seeing changes in agriculture. I know we had this discussion here once at NYCAMH that were we gonna put our own services eventually out of business? And I said no, because agriculture is constantly changing and evolving. And it will be different in 50 years from now. And I do think, for instance, we're going to see a lot more robotics in agriculture and a lot more information technology, such as I'm not sure if Bret and Dave utilize this on their farms, but the sensors that are in cow ears that they could pull up on their smartphones or a tablet or a computer to monitor their cows. I mean, to me, that is revolutionary. That is an extra set of eyes you have 24/7 on your cow. So technology is good, and I don't think people should be completely everything that's changing in agriculture is completely bad. I originally was of that mindset, but as I have gotten older, my mind has changed. My opinion and mindset has changed to that I realize that this has been going on. I found an article where there was an 80 cow dairy in Delaware County in the 1930s, and everybody thought that was terrible. And now an 80 cow dairy is small. So it's things just change, and you have to either be willing to change or and adapt. And I think sometimes we just get in our own mindset that we're unwilling to. And but I would like farmers to realize that they are important and that they are very talented, and people should never sell them short.
Brilliant, Duane. Brilliant. Thanks a million to our panelists, to Bret, to Jim, to Martin, or to Duane, and to David. Very, very much appreciated. I think we had a very nuanced discussion here today. I hope the attendees got something from it. And if you'd like to look back at the recording of this session, it's on our Fields of Knowledge website. Just scroll down to the bottom of that page. The recording of this session will be there. So we'll be back again. We're back on the Thursday, December 4th. We have a session that looks at farm service provision in supporting farmer mental health. It'll be another interesting conversation. We'll have perspectives, international perspectives, perspectives from the Midwest and New York State too as well. So thank you very much to all our attendees for attending today. As I said, I hope you got something from it. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. And finally, just to say a big thanks to the Fields of Knowledge team behind the scenes, Destiny Tremblay, Alison Flanagan too, for all the work that you've done to prepare for this session. Okay, and with that, I wish you all a good evening. Thank you very much.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.